As a teacher of English as a second language, I am very sensitive to the materials to which my students are exposed, especially since they can have a strong effect on my students' understanding of Western culture and, in particular, Western history. I don't live in the West, I live in Asia, where the average knowledge of Western history and culture is typically low. It predominantly arrives in the form of extremely biased Western pop culture before passing through various strongly ethnocentric local filters which distort it further. Consequently, local understanding of Western history and culture is not only often significantly inaccurate, but is also particularly vulnerable to misrepresentation. Recently, I have become concerned by the presence of indisputable propaganda in resources intended for non-native English speakers. This propaganda is clearly intended to present a biased view of history and socio-cultural topics with the obvious agenda of supporting conservative ideology. This is the first video in a series which will identify this content in books commonly used to teach English as a foreign language, examine the content to demonstrate its danger, and provide suggestions for how teachers and tutors using this material can counter its potentially harmful effects and guide their students to a better understanding of the topics which are being distorted. This video covers these topics. 1. Examples of this propaganda. 2. Why it is potentially dangerous. 3. Conclusion. Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. What I find particularly offensive is that this material is extremely insidiously placed. The books in which I am finding this material are English language learning books. In fact, they are books written to teach people how to succeed at standardized English tests such as TOEFL, the teaching of English as a foreign language. Although it's common for such books to contain material on topical subjects in history and politics, in the best books, such material is written in such a way as to avoid controversy and typically presents an objective view which is well supported by the standard scholarly consensus. In contrast, I find that extremely biased material is often being placed in a book where it is least expected and being presented to non-native English speakers, typically living in a non-native English-speaking country, who are highly vulnerable to accepting it uncritically as factual. For those people who complain that everything is being made political these days, this is a reminder that everything is always political. Nothing is being made political. It always has been. Examples of propaganda. Let's look at the kind of material I'm talking about. Here are a few examples from just one TOEFL guide, Bruce Sterling's book, Speaking and Writing Strategies for the TOEFL IBT, 2009 edition. Here's an excerpt from a reading passage in the book about Columbus. Quote, "Yet what brings us together as Americans is the name Christopher Columbus. Now, and in the past, we see in Columbus a man who embodies the spirit of freedom in which the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness is alive and well." End quote. It shouldn't need mentioning that there are very many Americans to whom the name Christopher Columbus is not a symbol of unity, and who would strongly disagree that Columbus is in any conceivable way symbolic of the freedom to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Despite this, the entire passage describes Columbus as a hero of the American people, both past and present. Here's an excerpt from a reading passage about the American Civil War. Quote, "The Civil War started when the South withdrew from the Union. The South accused the federal government of being a dictatorship intent on denying the Southern states the right to set their own laws, particularly in regard to the right to own slaves." End quote. This is an extremely misleading way to describe how the Civil War began. It repeats the false historical trope of the Civil War starting over the issue of states' rights. Although it says the idea of the federal government being dictatorial over states' rights was an accusation by the South, it never contradicts or even qualifies this accusation, leaving the impression that the charge is justified. Additionally, although it mentions the issue of slavery, it places this right at the end of the sentence as simply one example of states' rights being contested. This paragraph reinforces the false historical narrative of a war of northern aggression over the issue of states' rights. Here's an excerpt from a reading passage about Robert E. Lee, who fought on the side of the South in the American Civil War. Quote, "Of all the generals in the American Civil War, one stands above all the rest, Robert E. Lee. Lee defeated the Union Army and established his reputation as a general equal to Napoleon. Time and again, Lee defeated the much larger Union Army. At war's end, many in the North wanted Lee hung for treason. However, Lee never stood trial. Lincoln wanted reconciliation, not revenge." End quote. This is only an excerpt from several paragraphs, and I've removed some of the intervening material, which all describe Lee in an extremely positive light, praising his military skill and representing him as an honorable man fighting courageously for his state. The last few sentences have obviously been written with the objective of clearing Lee of any hint of culpability for being on the wrong side of history and morals, by first raising the idea of him being a traitor to the Union, and then tacitly dismissing the suggestion by describing his pardon by Lincoln in terms which are obviously intended to make the reader believe Lee was fully deserving of forgiveness. There is nothing in the paragraph which reveals Lee had a vested interest in the Civil War as a plantation owner who held many slaves and who insisted that slavery was beneficial for black people, despite claiming it was an evil which harmed white people. Nor is there any mention of his particularly harsh treatment of those slaves or his forceful suppression of them when they resisted. Readers are not told about the fact that Lee was the officer in charge of the soldiers who crushed John Brown's anti-slavery uprising in 1859. The final sentence, quote, "Lincoln wanted reconciliation, not revenge," end quote, effectively encourages the reader to believe that the Southern secessionists were worthy of forgiveness and sympathy, and that the Civil War itself is a matter which was closed with reconciliation many years ago. There is no hint of the long-lasting damage that the Civil War inflicted on American society, nor the fact that many of the earliest efforts to reconcile were met with dogged hostility and resentment by the Southern states. Nor is there any mention of the particularly dangerous pseudo-historical narrative of the lost cause, which emerged shortly after the Civil War as a way to validate the original secessionists, justify their motivations, and depict them as the hapless victims of an unequal, unfair, and oppressive invasion. Finally, here's an excerpt from a reading passage about the first Star Wars movie, now known today as Episode 4, A New Hope, written by George Lucas and produced in 1977. I must warn you that this is particularly offensive. Quote, "A popular Western theme is the kidnapping of a beautiful white maiden by savage Indians. This is exactly what happens in Star Wars. Princess Leia is captured not by Indians, but by Darth Vader, a metaphorical Indian chief, whose village, the Death Star, is a seemingly impenetrable fortress in which Princess Leia is being held." End quote. Remember, this is only part of the book's description of Star Wars, and it's not even the worst part. This reading passage actually starts by assuring the reader that Star Wars was based on classic American Western movies, with the good guys in white, represented by Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia's white clothes, and the bad guys in black, represented by Darth Vader and his black suit and armor. Leaving aside the utter confusion of this conclusion, given that Darth Vader's own stormtroopers are all completely in white, this interpretation of the movie is not only wildly inaccurate, but also breathtakingly racist. Casting this movie as a Western reinforces all of the harmful stereotypes of such movies, such as the depiction of Native American peoples as savage Indians, and a conflict between noble, civilizing white people and their violent, uncivilized, barbarous, non-white enemies. The entire description of this movie repeats these stereotypes without any criticism whatsoever, giving the impression that they are entirely valid. This is particularly ironic, given that Lucas' original motivation for writing Star Wars was criticism of Western imperialism. I believe this kind of material is a potential entry point into an ideological pipeline leading ultimately to the far right. That may sound overly dramatic or an unwarranted exaggeration, so now I'll explain why I hold this view. Why it is potentially dangerous. You might think I'm overstating the problem. After all, even if these teaching resources are biased, won't the students receive a more accurate understanding of the history at school? Won't the national curriculum contain a more balanced, objective view of these topics? The simple answer to those questions is no. In fact, the way history is taught here in Taiwan makes my students even more vulnerable to the kind of historical distortions I've described. Here in Taiwan, the teaching of history is explicitly nationalistic and intended to encourage citizens to become patriotically dedicated to the nation and its government. This translated quotation from a government textbook in the national curriculum explains the aims of the curriculum's history teaching program. Quote, "In particular, it stresses the long history and the blending of the culture of nationality in order to strengthen patriotic feelings and a cooperative spirit, and to understand the nation's traditions, its position, and the responsibility of the population." End quote. Historical education here is quite insular. The vast majority of the curriculum comprises Chinese history, supplemented by some national history. The curriculum contains very little world history, in particular very little European history, although World War II is given some coverage in both high school and university. Now you may reflect that this is perfectly acceptable. A nation perhaps should emphasize its own history, and although world history is important and useful, a certain ethnocentrism in a national history curriculum is to be expected, and in some cases may even be preferable. As an anarchist, I disagree with all that, but I know some people do think that way. You may also ask what relevance European history has to people in Asia anyway. Do they really need to know about the American Civil War? Is it of any importance to them to know about the evils of Columbus? Who cares if they don't understand the real meaning behind a 43-year-old American movie like Star Wars? There are 3 reasons why I believe it is of relevance to them. Firstly, as a general principle, I think it's both important and useful to learn an accurate history of other areas of the world to help gain a broader perspective of humanity and to be sensitive to the experiences of others in their time and place. This can provide insights into our own history and the way we relate to it. Learning about the harmful effects of historical wrongs in other nations and regions can prompt us to reflect on the harmful effects of events in the history of our own nation or culture. Secondly, the overwhelming majority of the students I teach intend to live overseas for a significant period during their higher education. Most of them intend to study college in the US. Consequently, it is important that their understanding of US culture and history is as accurate as possible and not distorted by US nationalism and patriotism. Arriving in the US with an inaccurate understanding of history, particularly a view influenced significantly by conservative propaganda, students would not only be less sensitive to those affected by historical white colonialism, racism, and supremacism, but would also run the risk of being further radicalized. Thirdly, there is the fact that the history of Taiwan itself is inextricably connected with European history. This is not because of colonization or imperialism, since this country was not colonized by the West. In fact, throughout history, it has been colonized by 2 different Asian imperialist powers, China and Japan. The issue is that Taiwan fought in the Second World War. Specifically, as a Japanese colony, it fought on the Axis side of the war as an ally of Japan and Germany. Military reenactments here don't focus on British and American soldiers, although you do sometimes see them represented. Instead, reenactors prefer to represent the German Wehrmacht and Japanese Imperial Army. Nazi uniforms are prevalent in reenactment, and people have no issue with it. Japanese imperial reenactors bring posters with propaganda claiming Japan was fighting a defensive war against Western imperialists. In 2007, a group of university students in Taiwan established a National Socialism Association with the aim of, quote, advocating national unity, strength, and curbing immigration, end quote. The Taiwan News, a local media outlet, reported the founder denying he was anti-Jewish and claiming he wished to, quote, foster greater nationalism in Taiwan, end quote. The student also said, quote, my main goal is to develop Taiwan's strength and to foster national unity. I think we have to work hard to restore traditional Chinese values like Confucianism, end quote. The Taiwan News article also cited Emil Sheng, a government official, explaining that the formation of this National Socialist movement was indicative of what the article described as Taiwan's, quote, ignorance of modern Western history, end quote. Sheng was quoted as saying, quote, people here don't really understand what Nazism is. They're not really racist or anti-Jewish. They don't even know what it means, end quote. In 2016, a number of Taiwanese high school students held a Nazi parade in full Nazi uniforms and regalia as part of their school's recreational activities. Although the event received widespread criticism for its insensitivity, and the headmaster resigned as an acknowledgement of culpability, there was a backlash by people who saw nothing wrong with the event, with the students' parents in particular responding angrily to criticism. An article in the Straits Times, part of the China Post Asia News Network, identified the incident as a product of Taiwan's own history and the way it is taught. The writer, Alan Fong, noted that although, quote, the parade was widely criticized in Taiwan society, end quote, some Taiwanese asked why there was a condemnation of Nazi representation, given that other authoritarians in Taiwan's history, such as Chinese military dictator Chiang Kai-shek, are both role-played and idealized. Fong added, quote, Taiwan's complicated history means that some of its people have a less than straightforward interpretation of World War II history, end quote. Fong also placed blame explicitly on Taiwan's education system, writing, quote, the why should I care attitude demonstrated by both the students who staged the rally and those who penned the response reflect the failure of Taiwan's utilitarian education system, in which school is regarded as little more than a 2-decade vocational training program. Students have little respect for history lessons because they are trained to view the subject as a series of facts that will allow them to pass an exam, end quote. Another reason why this propaganda material is potentially so dangerous is the way in which it is presented in these English language textbooks. This requires some understanding of how tests such as the TOEFL test are structured. In the TOEFL test, students encounter this material in 3 main forms. One form in which students will encounter this material in the TOEFL test is in the form of a reading exercise. In this case, they are presented with the material to read, and they must then answer questions about the content. The aim is to test their reading comprehension. Since students are graded according to the accuracy with which they demonstrate their understanding of the article's content, they are being required to reproduce the statements made in the reading articles. This conditions them to believe that the reading articles are entirely factual, especially since there are no alternative views presented and there is no criticism of the content. A second form in which students will encounter this material in the TOEFL test is a basic listening exercise. They will hear the material in the form of a lecture given by a professor, and they will then be required to demonstrate their comprehension of the content by answering questions. As with the reading exercise, this requires them to represent the material in the lecture accurately, and by repeating this material, they are conditioned to accept it as factual. This is reinforced by the fact that they encounter the material in the form of a lecture by a college professor, which gives the impression that the material is accurate, since it comes from a respected authority figure in an academic context, which is typically regarded as reliable. A third form in which students will encounter this material in the TOEFL test is as a reading material paired with a listening exercise. In this case, students will read a short article first, and then hear an excerpt from a lecture by a professor which criticizes the article. When the biased material is in the reading exercise, then the student will read that material first and then hear the student criticizing it. In theory, this sounds like an ideal situation, since the student will be hearing a corrective of the biased material to which they are exposed. However, in practice, it doesn't always work out that way. Firstly, according to the cognitive theory of primacy effect, people are more likely to remember information on a subject they encounter first than different information on the same subject which they encounter subsequently. Additionally, the primacy effect can influence the credibility of a source, depending on its content and presentation. Simply put, if the students receive a detailed and convincing sounding biased account of history first, they will be more likely to believe that even after receiving a corrective account which criticizes the earlier account. Secondly, the content of the listening exercise which criticizes the article the student has just read is not always very robust or detailed. Sometimes the critique is quite mild. Sometimes it only addresses the reading material in a superficial way. Frequently, it doesn't address all of the distortions in the article which the student has just read. Thirdly, when the student responds to the question they are given after reading the article and listening to the lecture excerpt, they are required to summarize the lecture's objections to the article. Again, this sounds like a good idea since they are being required to internalize the lecturer's corrections of the article's bias. However, this is not necessarily the perspective the student will take. It must be remembered that the student is not being told to summarize and represent accurately the lecturer's criticism of the article because that criticism is correct. They are not being told that they must understand the lecturer's view is accurate and the article's view is biased and flawed. Instead, they are simply being told to represent the lecturer's view because the purpose of the test is to determine how well they will be able to take notes in a professor's talk at college. A student with a subject on which two sides are presented formally in this way will typically conclude that the issue is still a matter of academic debate, with valid points on each side, and no settled conclusion. In fact, the student is more likely to conclude that the topic is still open for consideration, and that it is valid to hold either view. This is particularly dangerous since it presents a false equivalence in which both sides are considered equally valid. Conclusion. This video is the first in a series which will examine examples of this kind of propaganda and provide advice on how to address it. Each video will follow this format. Firstly, an English language teaching resource will be identified. Secondly, biased or misleading material in that resource will be presented. Thirdly, the material will be analyzed to describe its bias and the extent of its misrepresentation. Fourthly, suggestions will be made as to how to counter this bias within the context of a standard English teaching program. The extent of bias or misrepresentation within sources differs greatly. In some cases, the bias is mild, mainly in the form of omitting key facts. In other cases, the bias is extreme, in the form of misrepresenting key facts or even presenting as factual information which has been rejected by a mainstream scholarly consensus. Of particular importance is the way in which such material is addressed by the individual responsible for the student's instruction. Many language teachers do not feel it is their position or their responsibility to correct errors in the materials they use unless they are errors of language. Many language teachers do not consider it their duty to teach history or ethics. Some language teachers object strongly to the idea that English teaching is in any way connected to what they would call politics, and consider it irresponsible and unethical to correct the kinds of misrepresentations I describe here on the grounds that it would be imposing the teacher's personal view on the students. I reject all of these positions on the grounds that it is preeminently a teacher's responsibility to communicate facts and to use their position to combat misinformation which is socially harmful.